History, as they say, is written by the victors. But what happens when victory is a fantasy, when you're trapped, an enemy army in front of you, and an even bigger one marching to crush you from behind? This isn't some military thought experiment. This is the story of a commander who, staring down total annihilation, flipped the script with a plan so audacious it would be studied for centuries. This is the story of Julius Caesar at the Siege of Alesia. The year is 52 BC. For 6 long years, Julius Caesar has been dragging his Roman legions across the wild, untamed territories of Gaul, what we now know as France, Belgium, and Switzerland. One by one, the fiercely independent Gallic tribes fell, either conquered through brutal warfare or forced into uneasy alliances with Rome. Caesar's campaigns were relentless, a slow and grinding expansion of Roman influence that made him not only fabulously wealthy, but also a towering political figure back in Rome. Yet despite his victories, resentment was brewing among the Gallic people. They were tired of the Roman garrisons stationed in their towns, tired of watching their grain and livestock seized in the name of the Republic, and tired of being treated like subjects in their own lands. The fire of rebellion smoldered beneath the surface, waiting for the right spark to ignite it. That spark came in the form of a single man, Vercingetorix. He was a charismatic chieftain of the Arverni tribe, young but immensely ambitious, and unlike most Gallic leaders, he possessed a rare talent for both diplomacy and military strategy. Where others saw only ancient tribal rivalries, he saw the possibility of a united Gaul. Through persuasion, charisma, and sometimes sheer force, he achieved what no one before him had. He forged the scattered Gallic tribes into a single coalition with one purpose: to drive Caesar and his legions out of Gaul once and for all. Vercingetorix's strategy was both clever and ruthless. He understood that a direct confrontation with the Roman legions, masters of discipline and organization, would be suicidal. Instead, he sought to use the land itself as his weapon. He adopted a scorched-earth policy, ordering his followers to burn their own towns, farms, and fields so that the Romans would have no supplies to feed their vast army. Starvation, not the sword, would break Caesar. For a time, the strategy worked perfectly. Caesar's army, stretched thin across a hostile countryside and far from its supply bases, began to feel the effects of hunger. In one of the few defeats of his career, Caesar was beaten at the fortified town of Gergovia, Vercingetorix's own stronghold. The loss was a staggering blow to Roman prestige and a massive morale boost for the rebellion. It seemed that Gaul, after years of subjugation, might finally be on the verge of freedom. But Julius Caesar was not a man easily cornered. He regrouped his 10 legions, re-established his supply lines, and crucially, reinforced his army by recruiting a formidable contingent of Germanic cavalry. These riders, renowned for their ferocity and unmatched skill in battle, were the perfect counter to the Gallic horsemen, who had so often outmaneuvered the Romans. Vercingetorix, emboldened by his earlier victory at Gergovia, made a fateful decision. Believing Caesar's forces to be weakened, he launched a bold offensive, sending his cavalry to ambush the Roman marching column. But this time, his gamble failed disastrously. Caesar's newly acquired Germanic cavalry met the Gallic horsemen head-on and utterly destroyed them, driving them from the field in a rout that shattered their confidence. Realizing the scale of his miscalculation, Vercingetorix withdrew with his entire army, roughly 80,000 warriors, to the fortified hilltop stronghold of Alesia. The site was a natural fortress, perched high on a plateau with steep slopes and flanked by 2 rivers, making it an almost impregnable defensive position. From there, he planned to wait Caesar out, confident that his superior numbers and strong position would eventually force the Romans to retreat. But before Caesar could fully surround the fortress, Vercingetorix took one last strategic measure. he sent his remaining cavalry out of Alesia with an urgent message to all allied tribes across Gaul, ordering them to gather every available warrior and march to his aid. The plan was simple and brilliant. He would pin Caesar in place inside a trap, forcing the Roman general to divide his attention between besieging Alesia and fending off a massive relief force that would soon descend upon him. Once the relief army arrived, they would crush the Romans between two fronts, the hammer and the anvil. Caesar's situation was now as dire as it was absurd. He was deep inside enemy territory, surrounded by hostile lands. In front of him lay 80,000 Gallic warriors fortified within Alesia, while somewhere beyond the horizon, an even larger Gallic army was gathering to destroy him. Retreat was impossible without inviting pursuit and disgrace. A direct assault on Alesia's strong walls would be suicidal. Caesar found himself on the verge of becoming the besieger who was about to be besieged. Any ordinary commander might have surrendered to despair or attempted a desperate retreat, but Caesar was no ordinary man. His mind did not dwell on the hopelessness of his position. Instead, it saw opportunity in adversity. If Vercingetorix wanted a battle at Alesia, Caesar would give him one, but not on Gallic terms. He would fight on ground of his own choosing, shaped entirely by Roman ingenuity and engineering. His solution was as bold as it was unprecedented. He would not build one wall to encircle Alesia, he would build two. The first wall, known as the circumvallation, would completely surround Alesia, trapping Vercingetorix and his army inside and cutting them off from all supplies or reinforcements. But Caesar did not stop there. Anticipating the arrival of the Gallic relief army, he ordered the construction of a second, even longer outer wall, the contravallation, which would face outward, protecting the Romans from any attack from beyond. The scope of this project was staggering. The inner wall alone stretched for more than 10 miles around Alesia, fortified with towers, trenches, and earthen ramparts. The outer wall extended for 14 miles more, forming an immense double ring of defenses. Between them stood Caesar's army, a fortress shaped like a vast ring, with the Romans trapped between two enemies but encased within their own masterpiece of military engineering. In this extraordinary act of defiance, Caesar transformed what should have been his greatest weakness into his ultimate strength. The stage was set for one of the most astonishing sieges in ancient history. This wall was designed to protect his army from the attack he knew was coming. Caesar was, in effect, constructing a fortress shaped like a massive ring, with his legions encamped in the narrow space between two immense defensive lines. The Romans would occupy the middle ground, surrounded on one side by the enemy within Alesia and on the other by the enemy he knew would soon arrive. They would be, quite literally, both the besiegers and the besieged. For nearly a month, the Roman legionaries, men who were as skilled with pickaxes and shovels as they were with swords and shields, toiled day and night to bring Caesar's vision to life. They worked under constant threat of attack, digging, hauling, and constructing with relentless discipline. What they built was not merely a wall, but an elaborate and deadly system of layered defenses that modern historians and archaeologists still marvel at today. Caesar's own writings describe the complexity of the design, and modern excavations have confirmed that his engineers created a formidable network of trenches, ditches, and traps that turned the entire landscape into a killing field. Facing outward from the main Roman position was a terrifying zone of death. The Romans began by digging two deep trenches, each about 15 feet wide. One of these trenches was filled with water, diverted from nearby rivers to create an artificial moat, while the other was left dry and lined with sharpened stakes. Beyond the trenches lay an array of hidden traps and obstacles that would horrify any attacker who tried to cross them. There were the lilies, narrow, camouflaged pits, each containing a sharpened stake at the bottom, waiting to impale anyone unlucky enough to fall in. Beyond those came the kipi, large logs buried upright in the ground and embedded with iron hooks designed to catch and maim soldiers as they stumbled through. Finally, the field was strewn with stimuli, small sharpened wooden stakes driven into the earth in dense clusters. These seemingly insignificant obstacles would cripple horses, trip running men, and turn any organized advance into a chaotic massacre. Should an enemy somehow survive this hellish approach, they would still have to face the main rampart. This was no simple wall, but a towering 12-foot-high structure made from earth and timber, crowned with a sturdy wooden palisade. Every 80 feet, the wall was reinforced with tall towers from which Roman artillery, including catapults, scorpions, and ballistae, could rain down death upon attackers. The entire system was designed to break the momentum of any charge, forcing the enemy into narrow choke points where the disciplined legionaries could cut them down in close combat. The inner wall, which faced the fortress of Alesia, was built in much the same way, slightly smaller but just as deadly, ensuring that the Romans were protected on both fronts. Inside Alesia, the situation was growing desperate. Vercingetorix soon realized that his supplies were dwindling at an alarming rate. The grain stores and livestock that had sustained his massive army were running out, and there was no sign of the relief force yet. The chieftain was faced with an agonizing decision. To stretch what food remained, he ordered all civilians, the old, the sick, women and children, to be expelled from the city. Thousands poured out through the gates, desperate and starving, hoping that Caesar would take pity on them and allow them to pass through the Roman lines. Some may have even believed the Romans would provide food or safe passage, but Caesar was utterly ruthless. He refused to let them through, knowing that to do so would relieve the pressure on the defenders. The civilians were trapped in the barren strip of land between the walls of Alesia and the Roman siege lines, left with no food, no shelter, and no hope. Over the next several days, they slowly starved to death where they lay. Their cries echoed constantly through the night, a haunting and deliberate act of psychological warfare that weighed heavily on the morale of the Gallic warriors watching helplessly from their walls. It was a grim reminder of Caesar's cold efficiency and the price of rebellion against Rome. The Romans too were feeling the strain. Their own supplies were limited, and the relentless labor of building and defending the fortifications was wearing them down. Every day that passed brought them closer to exhaustion, and with each sunrise the fear grew that the Gallic relief army might appear at any moment. Still, they worked tirelessly, strengthening their defenses and preparing for the inevitable assault. When the final tower was raised and the last trench dug, the great double wall stood complete, an immense fortress of Roman ingenuity encircling Alesia. The trap was now fully set. All that remained was to wait. By late September, the waiting ended. From their lookout towers, Roman sentries spotted movement in the distance, the shimmering glint of metal, the dust of marching feet. The Gallic relief army had arrived. To the Romans, it must have looked like the earth itself was moving. A vast tide of warriors, glittering with spears and banners, advanced over the hills toward Alesia. Caesar later claimed that their number was around 250,000 infantry and 8,000 cavalry, though modern estimates suggest closer to 100,000 in total. Even so, it was an enormous host, dwarfing Caesar's force of roughly 50,000 men. The relief army was commanded by a council of Gallic chiefs, among them Vercingetorix's cousin Vercingetorix, a fierce and capable leader in his own right. Now Caesar's legions stood in the most precarious position imaginable, trapped between two immense enemy forces, 80,000 warriors inside Alesia and roughly twice that number outside. Outnumbered more than 3 to 1, the Romans were an island of order and discipline surrounded by a sea of hostile fury, yet it was an island of their own making, protected by the very walls that their sweat and blood had built. The final decisive battle for Gaul began. The first assault came from the relief army. Their cavalry surged across the plains, thundering toward the Roman outer wall, while their infantry followed in dense ranks behind. Inside Alesia, Vercingetorix heard the sounds of battle and seized his moment, ordering a full-scale assault from within the fortress. What followed was chaos. The Romans were stretched to their limits, fighting on two fronts at once, with barely enough men to hold the lines. Caesar, mounted and clad in his crimson general's cloak, rode along the ramparts, shouting orders and urging his soldiers to stand firm. His presence inspired them, and the fortifications performed exactly as intended. The traps and trenches tore apart the Gallic formations, breaking their charge before it reached the main wall. The legionaries fought with grim precision, cutting down the disorganized attackers as they struggled through the killing ground. Then came the decisive moment. Caesar ordered his Germanic cavalry to strike. With terrifying speed, they charged out from the Roman lines and smashed into the flanks of the Gallic horsemen, scattering them in panic. The relief army faltered, their momentum broken. As night fell, the Romans still held the walls. The first great assault had failed, but the Gauls were far from finished. Under the cover of darkness, they regrouped and launched another attack. The night exploded with the sound of horns, shouting, and clashing metal. Flames flickered along the ramparts as both sides fought hand to hand in the dark. Confusion reigned, and for a time, it seemed that the immense pressure of two armies might finally crush the Roman defenses. The struggle for Alesia had entered its most desperate phase. In a few places, the Gauls managed to break through the Roman defenses, but Caesar had anticipated that a night attack might come. He was prepared. His mind, ever calculating, had arranged for mobile reserves to stand ready under the command of two of his most trusted lieutenants, Mark Antony and Gaius Trebonius. When the alarm was raised, these reserves reacted instantly. They surged forward to reinforce the threatened sectors, plugging the breaches in the line and driving the Gallic warriors back toward the walls of Alesia. The attack, which had begun with such energy, was quickly losing steam. Inside the fortress, Vercingetorix's great assault had failed to gain momentum. His warriors struggled to fill in the Roman trenches and cross the layers of defenses that had been engineered with such deadly precision. Mud, sharpened stakes, and concealed pits slowed their progress. The element of surprise, so crucial to their plan, vanished in the confusion. As dawn broke over the battlefield, the Gallic chieftain was forced to face the truth. The second assault had failed, but the Gauls were not finished yet. They now understood that a frontal attack against the Roman fortifications was useless. Their scouts, however, had discovered something that offered a sliver of hope, a weakness. To the north of Alesia stood a large hill that had been impossible for Caesar to include within his siege lines. On that hill, the Romans had built a smaller secondary camp, but its defenses were less formidable than the main fortifications. It was a vulnerability, and the Gallic commanders knew it. This would be the place for their final desperate attempt to break the siege, an all-or-nothing assault that would decide the fate of Gaul. The task of leading this critical operation fell to Vercingetorix, a Gallic nobleman and cousin of Vercingetorix, known for his courage and leadership. 60,000 of Gaul's best warriors were placed under his command. Under the cover of darkness, he led them on a grueling night march, circling through the hills to take position behind the Roman northern camp. His plan was to strike at midday, in perfect coordination, with a renewed attack from both the relief army and the forces inside Alesia. Vercingetorix's troops would launch themselves at the weak northern point of the Roman defenses. The main Gallic army outside would assault the outer walls to prevent Caesar from sending reinforcements north. At the same time, from within Alesia, Vercingetorix and his warriors would surge out in a final, suicidal charge. It was a masterful plan. If everything went right, Caesar's army would be crushed between three converging attacks. When the signal was given, the assault began. The Gallic warriors charged with ferocious energy, their horns and war cries echoing across the plains. From the north, Vercingetorix's men stormed the Roman camp, overwhelming its defenders and breaking through the outer rampart. The Romans fought desperately, but the sheer weight of numbers drove them back step by step. The battle reached its most dangerous point. The Roman line was bending, and in places it was beginning to give way. The entire army stood on the brink of disaster, and it was in this moment of crisis that Caesar showed why history remembers his name. He did not panic. While lesser men might have faltered or fled, he remained calm, scanning the battlefield and issuing precise orders. He sent reserves to reinforce the collapsing sectors, ensuring that every available man was where he was most needed. But as he watched the northern camp crumble under the relentless pressure of Vercingetorix's attack, he understood that the situation had become critical. The defenses there were about to fail completely. Knowing that only his personal presence could turn the tide, Caesar gathered a small contingent of troops and rode straight into the chaos. His famous scarlet cloak, bright against the dust and smoke of battle, marked him out instantly to friend and foe alike. The sight of their commander, fearless and commanding in the thick of combat, electrified the Roman soldiers. Their wavering line steadied, and they began to fight back with renewed fury. Even so, the Gauls kept coming. The pressure was immense, the air thick with shouting, clashing iron, and the screams of the wounded. Realizing that holding the line would not be enough, Caesar made a final, audacious gamble, one that would decide the battle. He ordered his top cavalry commander, Titus Labienus, to take several cohorts of legionaries and a portion of the cavalry, leave the safety of the fortifications entirely, and circle the battlefield. Their mission was to strike the Gallic army from behind. It was a breathtakingly risky maneuver. By sending these men away, Caesar weakened other parts of his defensive line, but he knew that boldness was the only path to victory. As Labienus and his troops disappeared into the distance, the fighting in the northern camp reached its peak. Roman discipline was being tested to the limit as wave after wave of Gauls surged forward. The Romans were exhausted, battered and bloodied, and for a moment it seemed that they would finally be overwhelmed. Then, cutting through the chaos, came a new sound, the blare of Roman trumpets echoing across the field from the rear of the Gallic army. Labienus had arrived. His cavalry came thundering down on Vercingetorix's forces from behind, smashing into their ranks with devastating force. The Gauls, who only moments before believed they were on the verge of victory, suddenly found themselves surrounded. Panic spread like wildfire through their lines. The disciplined Romans pressed from the front while the cavalry tore into them from behind, cutting off any route of escape. What had been a fierce attack dissolved into chaos. Warriors dropped their weapons trying to flee, only to be cut down or trampled in the confusion. The Germanic cavalry, unleashed in pursuit, showed no mercy, chasing down the fleeing Gauls across the fields. Within hours, the once mighty relief army was shattered. Seeing their allies annihilated before their eyes, the other Gallic forces lost heart and broke, retreating in disorder. The Battle of Alesia was over. Caesar had achieved an impossible victory. When the dust settled, the fields around Alesia were a nightmare of death and ruin. Tens of thousands of Gallic warriors lay slain. Ancient sources may exaggerate the numbers, but the result is beyond doubt. The great Gallic relief army had ceased to exist as a fighting force. Inside Alesia, despair set in. The defenders had watched from their walls as their last hope vanished in smoke and blood. Their relief army had been destroyed, their food was gone, and their spirit was crushed. Vercingetorix knew the end had come. The next morning he called his war council, calmly, with the dignity of a leader who knew his cause was lost. He told his officers that he had fought not for personal glory, but for the freedom of Gaul. The struggle was over. He offered them two choices: they could kill him and present his body to Caesar as an offering, or they could surrender him alive. After a grim silence, they chose surrender. Caesar, triumphant, ordered the defeated Gauls to lay down their weapons and for their chiefs to come forward. Then, in one of history's most haunting scenes, Vercingetorix emerged from the gates of Alesia, clad in his finest armor. He rode his horse down the slope and into the Roman camp. As Caesar sat in judgment, surrounded by his officers, the Gallic leader circled him once, dismounted, and silently cast his weapons at the feet of his conqueror. Not a word was spoken. Vercingetorix was taken prisoner. For 6 long years he languished in captivity, a living symbol of Gaul's defeat, before being paraded through the streets of Rome in Caesar's grand triumph. When the celebration was over and the crowds dispersed, the proud chieftain was quietly executed in his cell, strangled in the darkness, his rebellion extinguished forever.